Meaningless Life. Both our religious and political traditions have taught us to think of every human life as having an inherent worth. Human beings are thus thought of as unique within the whole of creation. But this is not the verdict of experience. Most of the people you see on the streets, coming and going, appear to live to no purpose beyond the present moment. The days come and go, each much like all the others, and through the minds of most persons pass only the most trivial thoughts, the concerns of the moment, a trifling victory here, a similarly insignificant defeat there, a succession of momentary pleasures, interrupted by insignificant frustrations. Even those whose lives are not a mindless going through motions usually have no greater purpose than some personal gratification, such as the accumulation of wealth, or power, or toys on a grand scale, or status. Things that are no sooner won than new desires emerge as worthless as those already achieved. The great majority of humankind then pass from the stage and enter the oblivion of the millions, now forgotten, who have preceded them, and whose lives were essentially no different. Thus meaningful life is no birthright. It is something which, if it is to be had at all, must be won, and apparently won against considerable odds. Most persons never achieve it at all. Meaning and time. Nothing, including human existence, gains meaning merely through the passage of time. That a human life should be prolonged adds nothing to its significance, in spite of the almost universal prejudice to the contrary. If it lacked meaning to begin with, then its prolongation is but an enlargement of that meaninglessness. Time does, nonetheless, provide the condition for life's meaning, for it is the necessary condition for both personal and social history. History does not consist merely of a succession of events. If it were otherwise, then a clock, which did nothing but tick off the moments and the hours, could be said to have a history. Or similarly, the surface of the sea, with its succession of turbulence and calm. That there is such a thing as human history is the result not merely of the fact that the generations perpetually arise and pass away, but rather of the fact that human beings, or rather some human beings, have a capacity to create things. And it is this, as we shall see, this capacity to create, which we alone share with the gods, that gives our lives whatever meaning they have. Time in a lifeless world. To see this, let us begin by thinking of the whole of inanimate reality, that is, the entire world as devoid of life. This would be a world without history or meaning. What happens in that world has happened before, and considering any event by itself, it makes no difference when it happens, nor even any sense to assign it a date. Time here is irrelevant. The earth turns, for example, but it makes not the least difference whether a given rotation is the millionth or 100 millionth. Each turning is the same as the others, and no assigning of a number to this one or that has any significance. And so it is with everything else that happens in that lifeless world. A mountain rises gradually and is gradually eroded, but it makes no difference when this happens. And raindrops fall, but that a given raindrop should fall at one time rather than another does not matter, nor is it even easy to make such temporal distinctions. Each drop is just like any other, and no newness is introduced by supposing that it falls earlier, or later, or even millions of years earlier or later. Combinations of events might occur which occur at no other time, to be sure, but they are already contained in what has gone before. What happens is but a consequence of what has already happened. Such a world could not, to any god contemplating it and capable of understanding it, contain any surprises. Nothing, in short, would ever be created in such a world. There would be novelties of sorts, for example, a snowflake that resembled no other, but these would not be creations in any sense. They would be but novel combinations of what has already existed and then pointlessly fell into those combinations. That lifeless world, in short, resembles a clockwork, but one from which the moving hands are missing. What interests us about a clock is that it tells time. But the lifeless world we are now imagining tells us nothing of the sort. On the contrary, the very image of it is enough to exclude considerations of time. A god would discover nothing from the prolonged contemplation of such a world other than that which he already knew, and what he could anticipate in it would be nothing not already implicit in his memories of it. Time, to be sure, would exist for such a god. Otherwise his contemplation could not be prolonged, nor would it make sense to speak of his memories. But then, by introducing such a being we have, of course, abandoned our premise of a lifeless world. Life and time. Let us next, then, add to this lifeless world, in our imaginations, the whole of living creation, excluding only rational beings. That is to say, beings like ourselves, who are in the broadest sense capable not only of understanding, but also of creative thought and action. What we have now is still a world without history. Except for the long and gradual changes wrought by biological evolution, nothing new or different occurs in this world. The sun that rises one day illuminates nothing that was not there the day before, or 1,000 or 1,000,000 days before. It is simply the same world, age after age. The things in it exactly resemble those that went before. Every sparrow is just like every other, does exactly the same things in the same way without innovation, then to be imitated by every sparrow to follow. The robin or squirrel you see today does nothing different from those you saw as a child, and could be interchanged with them without discernible difference. Each creature arises and lives out its cycle with an invariance that is almost as fixed as the clockwork we imagined a moment ago. And it is, again, a clockwork without hands. That such a creature should live today, or 100 years hence, makes no difference. There are days in this world, but no dates. And each such creature then perishes, leaving behind it nothing whatsoever, except more of the same kind, which will do the same things again and beget the same, these unchanging cycles then to be repeated over and over, forever. The sense of time. The introduction of living things into our imaginary world has, however, resulted in one significant difference, and that is the rudimentary sense of time, at least among some creatures. Irrational beings do not, of course, contemplate in thought their own graves, reflectively make provision for their descendants, mark anniversaries and so on. But they must nevertheless sometimes feel time's passage. A trapped animal feels its life ebbing and senses the approach of death. And perhaps birds, however mechanical or instinctive their behaviour may be, have some anticipation of what is going to be done with the nest they build. Our pets anticipate their meals and look forward to them, and possibly the hours drag for them when we leave them home alone for the day. So to that extent time has, in a significant sense, been introduced into our world by the addition to it of living things. But there still remains this huge difference. These creatures have no history. Each does today what was done by those that went before, and will be done by those to come. The world we are imagining thus resembles an endless play, in which the acts are all identical. Every stage setting is the same as every other. The lines spoken are the same, the costumes the same, and the things done the same. Only the actors change, but none introduces any innovation. It would make no difference to any audience which act they saw, nor would there be any point in numbering the acts, or noting which followed which. The world just described is not, of course, an imaginary one. It is the very world we live in, considered independently of ourselves and our place in it. It is a world in which there is a before and after. The sun, for example, must have risen in order to set, and it is one in which the passage of time is felt. Yet it is timeless in another significant sense. It has neither history nor meaning. Its meaninglessness is precisely the meaninglessness of the play we were just imagining. There is never anything new, no purpose, no goal. In a word, nothing is ever created. An ancient image of meaninglessness. This sense of eternal meaninglessness was perfectly captured by the ancients in the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, it will be recalled, was condemned by the gods to roll a stone to the top of a hill, whereupon it would roll back to the bottom, to be moved to the top once more by Sisyphus, then to roll back again, and so on, over and over, throughout eternity. Here, surely, is existence reduced to utter meaninglessness. Nor does that lack of meaning arise from the onerousness of Sisyphus' task. It would not be redeemed if the task were made easier, by representing the stone as a very small one, for example. Nor does that meaninglessness emerge from the sheer boredom of the task. It would still be there even if we imagine Sisyphus to rejoice in it. If we imagine, for example, that he had a compulsive and insatiable desire to roll stones, and considered himself blessed to be able to do this forever. The meaninglessness exhibited in this myth is precisely the meaninglessness of the world as it has been described up to this point. Namely, that of a world without history, a world that is in this significant sense devoid of time. It is, like the cycles of Sisyphus, a world of endless and pointless repetition. The emergence of meaning. If we now modify the story of Sisyphus in certain ways, we can take the crucial step needed to transform it from an image of meaninglessness to one of meaning. In so doing, we can finally see what is needed to give the world and human existence, or the life of any individual person, meaning. Let us first suppose, then, that Sisyphus does not roll the same stone over and over again to the top, but moves a different stone each time, each stone then remaining at the top of the hill. Does this make a difference? Hardly. One stone does not differ from another, so what Sisyphus is now doing is essentially what he was doing before, rolling a stone, over and over, to the top of a hill. The stones, for all we know, merely accumulate there as a huge and growing pile of rubble. So let us next imagine that this is not so, that the stones, having been moved to the top of the hill, are, one by one, over a long period of time, assembled, not by Sisyphus, but by others, into something beautiful and lasting, a great temple, we might suppose. Has Sisyphus' existence now gained meaning? In a sense it has, for his labour is no longer wasted and pointless. Something important does come of it all. But that existence might still be totally meaningless to Sisyphus. For what we have imagined is consistent with supposing that he is totally ignorant of what is happening. That he is aware only of rolling stones, with no notion at all of what becomes of them, the temple being entirely the work of others and out of his sight and ken. From his point of view, then, nothing has changed at all. We next imagine, then, that this latter is not so, that Sisyphus sees the fruit of his toil gradually take shape, is aware of its importance and beauty, and thus has at least the satisfaction of understanding what is happening, and realizing that what he does is not totally in vain. Something important does come of it all, something that is great and beautiful, and it is something that is understood. Now have we invested his existence with meaning? In a sense we have, for Sisyphus has been converted from a mere beast of burden to a being who understands. But there is still a lot missing. For what we now have before us is consistent with the idea that Sisyphus is a mere slave, a rational slave up to a point, to be sure, but still one who goes through endless and repetitive motions over which he has no choice, these being entirely dictated by others, and for a result in which he has no choice, but can only passively observe. To revert to our own image of the endlessly repetitive stage play, Sisyphus is here like an actor whose luck is to be cast in the leading role, but with this difference. An actor can at least reject the role. Such an existence is not without fulfillment of a sort, but we must remember that it still corresponds to the meaningless, and, in a significant sense, timeless existence into which the whole of animal creation is cast. The vast array of living cycles today resemble those of 1,000 years ago, and will resemble those of 1,000 years hence. Nature, so conceived, is not without grandeur and beauty, just as we can imagine a temple that rises from Sisyphus' labours to have the same qualities. But that image still lacks an essential ingredient of meaningfulness, unless, of course, we are willing to ascribe a fully meaningful existence to a merely productive machine, or to a slave who has no voice whatsoever in his own fate, or even his own actions, from one moment to the next. One final modification is needed, then, and that is to imagine that Sisyphus not only moves this prodigious quantity of stones to the top of the hill, but that he does so for the very purpose of seeing them converted to a beautiful and lasting temple. Most important of all, this temple must be something of his own, the product of his own creative mind, of his own conception, something which, but for his own creative thought and imagination, would never have existed at all. Creation, meaning, and time. It is at this point, then, that the idea of a fully meaningful existence emerges. For the first time, it is inseparable from the concept of creativity. And it is exactly this that was missing from everything we have imagined up until now. Nature, however beautiful and awesome, exhibits nothing of creative activity until we include in it rational beings. That is, beings who can think, imagine, plan, and execute things of worth. Beings who are, in the true sense, originators or creators. Rational beings do not merely foresee what will be, they sometimes determine what will be. They do not, like the rest of creation, merely wait to see what nature will thrust upon them. They sometimes impose upon nature herself their own creations, sometimes creations of great and lasting significance. Rational beings are the very creators of time itself, in the historical sense, for without them, they would be only a meaningless succession of things and no history at all. An animal can, perhaps, anticipate its own death, as can a person, and an animal can bring about works, sometimes of considerable beauty and complexity, as can a person. But what the animal thus does has been done in exactly that way millions of times before. One thinks of the complex beauty of the spider's web, the intricate basketry of the oriole's nest, the ingenious construction of the honeycomb, all things of impressive intricacy, sometimes arresting and marvellous, but also things that disclose not the least hint of creative power. They are, like Sisyphus' labours, only endless repetitions. Human beings, or at least some of them, are capable of going a crucial step further. What a creative mind brings forth is never something merely learned or inherited, nor is it merely something novel, like the snowflake that resembles no other. It is what a creative mind intends it to be, something to which the notions of success or failure can apply, and sometimes something of such extraordinary originality that no other man or god, no one but its creator himself, could ever have foreseen. And if that creative mind possesses, in addition to this, the rare quality of creative genius, then what is wrought is not merely something that others could neither do nor foresee. It is something they could not even imagine. Thus we see the aptness of Schopenhauer's dictum, that while talent is the ability to hit a target that others miss, genius is the ability to hit a target that others do not even see. The ancients, in their philosophies, were fond of describing their gods as rational. This idea of divine rationality has persisted among metaphysicians, but the concept of rationality has become narrowed. We think of rationality as care and precision in thought, a due regard for evidence and consistency, and sometimes as mere restraint in conduct. But the ancients quite properly associated it with the contemplative life in the broadest sense, the creation of things beautiful, profound, and unprecedented expressed for them the essence of human rationality. Sisyphus displayed his ultimate rationality, not merely in understanding what he was doing, something that would be within the power of a mere slave, but, as we have modified the myth, in the display of strength and genius that took the form of a beautiful and lasting temple, born first in his own imagination. That was something that no mere slave, and indeed no mere human being, and in fact no other being under the sun except this one, could ever have done. The creative genius of a particular person is something that by its very nature cannot be shared. To the extent that it is shared, such that what it brings forth is also brought forth by others, then it is not only not genius, it is not even a creative power. It is but the capacity for fabrication which, however striking it may be, is quite common throughout nature. The creation of things great and small. Lest the impression be given that the creative thought and work that I am here praising is something rare, the possession of only a few, let it be noted that it exists in degrees and is, in one form or another, far from rare. What is rare, I think, the proper appreciation of it. We tend to think of creative works as spectacular achievements, particularly in the arts, but in fact the human capacity to create something new is sometimes found in quite mundane things. Thus, for example, the establishment of a brilliant position in a game of chess is a perfect example of creativity, even though the result is of little value. Things as common as gardening, woodworking, and the like give scope to the originality of those who have the knack for them, and are probably the most constant source of life's joys. Intelligent, perhaps witty conversation, and the composition of clear and forceful prose are just as good examples of creativity as the making of a poem of great beauty or depth of meaning, however much they may differ in worth. Another example of a creative work, and one whose value as a creation is rarely appreciated, is the raising of a beautiful family, something that is reserved for the relatively few who can, as a natural gift, do it well. Of course, the mere begetting of children is no act of creation at all. It is something that can be done by anyone. And other creatures, sometimes with great skill, convert their young to self-sufficient adults. They succeed, however, only to the extent that these young exactly resemble themselves, whereas rational human parents should measure their success by the degree to which their children become self-sufficient and capable adults who do not resemble their parents, but express instead their own individualities. This is an art that is neither common nor easily learned. Opposing conceptions of meaningful existence. It would be gratifying if, in the light of what I have been saying, we could now rest upon the comfortable conclusion that our lives derive their meaning from the fact that human beings, and they alone, impose a history upon nature, that the world does not merely persist from age to age, nor does it merely change in the manner of the endless recurrences we see throughout the rest of creation, but that changes are imposed upon it by the creative power of humankind. That would be true, but too general, for, in truth, creative power is not something particularly sought and prized by most people. Our culture has taught us to regard all persons as of equal worth, and our religion tells us that this is even God's estimate. Indeed, we are taught that we are, each and every one, created in the very image of that God, so that no one can claim for himself more importance than anyone else. Our lives, it is implied, are invested with great meaning just by virtue of our common humanity. We need only to be born, and our worth is once and for all assured. We are, to be sure, set apart from the remainder of creation, according to this tradition, but what sets us apart is not necessarily anything we do. We are set apart by what is merely given to us, so that a human life, and a valuable and meaningful life, are presumed to be one and the same. That conception of meaningful existence, which is so familiar, omits the essential ingredient of meaningfulness. For in truth, creative power is no common possession. Creative genius is in fact rare. The work of the vast majority of persons does not deviate much from what others have already done and from what could be found everywhere. There seems even to be a determination in most people that this should be so. A determination to pattern their lives after others, to seek as little originality and individual self-worth as possible. People tend, like apes, to mimic and imitate what they already find, absorbing the ideas, manners, values, even indeed their religions from those around them, as if by osmosis. They appropriate virtually everything, returning virtually nothing of their own creative power. The lives of most persons are like the clockwork alluded to previously. They are born, pass through the several stages of life, indulging, for the most part, in only trivial thoughts and feelings, absorbing pleasures and distractions, fleeing boredom, conceiving no significant works, and leaving almost nothing behind them. It would be sad enough if this were merely so. What is far sadder is that it is thought not really to matter. Religion then reinforces this by proclaiming that no one can, in God's sight, rise above others anyway, that the fool is already as blessed as the wise, and that the greatest possible human worth has already been bestowed upon us all by our merely being born. It is a hard notion to overcome, and weighs upon us like lead. It tends to render even the exemplary among us weak and hesitant. We take much comfort in that part of the Bible, the very first book, which assures us that we are all the veritable images of God. We tend to overlook the first 5 words with which the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created. That the result of that act is heaven and earth may be overwhelming, but the emphasis is wrong if we dwell on that. What is significant is that the original description of God is as a creator, and it is this, surely, that endows one with the divine quality. That human beings exist is not, in itself, a significant fact. That this or that being is possessed of human form, or is of that biological species, is likewise of no significance, whatever may be the teaching of religion and custom to the contrary. What is significant, what gives any human existence its meaning, is the possibility that out of this existence arises creative power. But it is no more than a possibility, realized here and there, more or less, and fully realized only in exceptional persons. In praise of greatness, one brings to consciousness the indescribable worth of creative power by imagining specific instances. Consider, for example, that on a given day the sun rose, as usual, and that throughout that day most of the world was much as it had been the day before, virtually all of its inhabitants doing more or less what they are accustomed to doing. But in a minute part of that world, a nocturne of Chopin's came into being, or a sonata of Mozart's. On another day, otherwise much like any other, Lincoln composed his address for the visit to Gettysburg, or Matthew Arnold wrote the concluding lines of his Dover Beach, or Gray his Elegy, or Plato his Symposium. That a little-known woman gave birth to an infant in Malaga, Spain, one October day in 1881, means very little, but that the child was to become Picasso means much. And to complete this kind of imaginative exercise, one needs to fix in his thought some significant creation, something perhaps as small but priceless as a prelude of Chopin, or a poem of Keats, and then realize that if a particular person had not, at just that moment, brought forth that utterly unprecedented thing, then it would never have existed at all. The thought of a world altogether devoid of music, or literature, or art, is the thought of a world that is dark indeed. But if one dwells on it, the thought of a world lacking a single one of the fruits of creative genius that our world actually possesses is a depressing one. That such a world would have been so easy, so inevitable, but for a solitary person at a single moment is a shattering reflection. This vision of greatness is as old as philosophy. One wishes it were the theme of religion as well, for the voice of religion is always louder than that of philosophy. That a world should exist is not finally important, nor does it mean much, by itself, that people should inhabit it. But that some of these should, in varying degrees, be capable of creating worlds of their own, and history, thereby creating time in its historical sense, is what gives our lives whatever meaning they have.